Welcome, I'm Martin Reg Kahn, host of the Ryerson Democracy Forum, where we ask people how to do democracy differently, how to get people engaged, how to keep them involved, how to keep the faith. A special welcome if you're joining us today on television, and thank you to CPAC for carrying our events. Our guest today is Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae. And before I formally introduce him, I'd like to formally introduce and acknowledge the land that Ryerson University is on. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which refers to a treaty among the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Over time, Indigenous nations and peoples and all newcomers have been invited onto this territory in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Now, before I talk about the ambassador, my job is to first introduce myself. I write a political column for the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest and best daily newspaper. In my other life, I'm a visiting practitioner here in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson and founder of the Ryerson Democracy Forum. And in my spare time, I'm a fellow at the Munk Center at U of T. But in my previous life, I was a foreign correspondent for the Star. And for me, the big story was always democracy, covering the ordinary people who were sometimes prepared to die for democracy. And so when I came home to Canada, I really wanted to give expression to my passion. Now today, we're talking about that world out there, but also a world closer to home, across the border where Mr. Rae is based in Canada and around the world. Now, the title for our forum is Canada and the World, Ambassador Bob Rae at the UN. So let me tell you a little bit about the ambassador. His appointment last year was the culmination of a truly remarkable career in politics and policymaking that I have witnessed and sometimes covered over the years. Most recently, he was the Prime Minister's special envoy investigating the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. But he was elected as Ontario's 21st Premier in 1990, and he led the federal Liberals from 2011 to 2013. He was elected 11 times to the House of Commons and the Ontario legislature, not at the same time, but serially over the course of 35 years from 1978 to 2013, off and on. So he has lived 9 lives in politics, and now he has this afterlife at the UN in New York, which is really interesting. Now, in between, he, among other things, he headed a few public inquiries, including one on post-secondary education in Ontario. So that's a question you might want to ask him. But he's done important work advising Indigenous groups. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He also taught at the Munk School. And above all, he is a multitasker. He is a labor lawyer by profession. He is a politician by disposition. And now he is a diplomat by destiny because his father was one before him. Mr. Ambassador, Bob, if I may, we are lucky to have you with us. Welcome to our Ryerson Democracy Forum. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. The answers that we get from our guests today are only as good as my questions, but also yours. So please start thinking up your questions. It's really easy. Just use the chat function probably at the bottom of your screen, and Ryerson's Melissa Wong will gather them up, hand them off to me. This Zoom function does not allow others to ask. It has to come through me. So you can stay in your boxer shorts and fire away, and I will read them out on your behalf. So let us solve the world's problems. We only have a few minutes left. And Mr. Rae, I'd like to start at the beginning. Can you hear me all right, by the way, Bob?
Perfectly.
Good, okay, and welcome again. Bob, last October, our guest was David McNaughton, the former Canadian ambassador to Washington, and we were talking about the post-Trump era, if it was going to be post-Trump. And there was a lot of pessimism and a bit of optimism, but nobody was able to see an insurrection before the inauguration. And now Joe Biden is in office. There's been a reset, but just tell us from where you sit, just to set the stage, set the table for today, about how the world has changed, how your world has changed, how America and the world has changed, and what it means for the UN and for all of us.
Well, I think, Martin, thanks very much, and thank you for your very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be back at Ryerson. I have, in fact, I went with a group of Ryerson students to Washington just a couple of years ago. Arlene and I were there, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here and answering questions. I think the election of Mr. Biden is really quite significant. I think you would have had to have put the United States in a kind of group of countries that I would call sort of authoritarian populist in their thinking, more isolationist, extremely transactional. What's in it for me? Kind of approach to things. The president was not interested in Mr. Trump was not interested in the UN. Didn't like it. Came once and gave a speech which is all about the United States. He just used it as a platform. You know, America does have a deep state, and there were a lot of good professional diplomats from the United States here. They continued to fund important aspects of, you know, international activity, refugee activity, and others. But really, there's a lot of things that went wrong. I mean, the relationship with the World Health Organization, the relationship with the World Trade Organization, just generally hostile to a lot of the kinds of engagements which are absolutely essential for a country which aspires to leadership. And I think Mr. Biden is the polar opposite of that. I think he wants to engage. He wants to be multilateral. He wants to be an active supporter of the United Nations and other institutions. I know that he's spoken on the phone a couple of times to the Secretary General. He knows the Secretary General very well. He's named a very, very capable ambassador who's went through her hearings yesterday. We're hoping that she's going to be sworn in as quickly as possible. I'm really looking forward to working with her. I don't think it's as simple as, you know, the United States is back, you know, don't worry about it, everything's okay. It's way more complicated than that. The world is a complicated place. But I think that a number of us who have been feeling and on a multilateral basis, really feeling not only the absence, but frankly, in some cases, the indifference of the U.S. Are really relieved. I also have to say, however, that Ambassador Kraft, who was the American ambassador to Canada and then became the American ambassador to the UN, is a very nice person and a very thoughtful person, and generally speaking, well liked by your colleagues and respected. And she did some very positive things at a personal level, but she also, in the case of, for example, the two Michaels, which I'm sure we'll talk about, she was extremely supportive of me and very supportive of our government in our efforts to draw some attention to this issue.
That's really interesting. I was actually going to ask you as a follow-up about her. She was, as you say, the ambassador to Ottawa. Actually had a close relationship or a good relationship with Premier Doug Ford as well. And so I guess it's not surprising, having spent that time in Canada, that she would have been engaged on an issue of great importance to us. So, and you've mentioned the incoming UN ambassador, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. So let's pivot from one superpower to the other, to China. And Canada is caught in the middle. They have reinvented the rules of international relations. There's even a word for their diplomacy now, wolf warrior diplomacy. It's very aggressive. It's not the Chinese diplomacy that many of us saw in previous years. And now it has moved on to hostage diplomacy with the two Michaels, and in particular, a career diplomat, Michael Kovrig. So 2 years in captivity in retaliation for the Huawei affair and potential deportation. While that was happening in the last few months, you caused a diplomatic storm of your own by asking the UN Human Rights Council to investigate China's handling of its minority Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang province and to investigate genocide. And China's foreign ministry, the wolf warrior diplomacy, kicked into action and attacked you quite strongly, personally. So where do we stand with China? How do you reinvent a diplomacy that protects our interests, that defends our interests, that helps to defend the interests and the rights to human rights of the Uyghur minority in China, when everything has basically been turned upside down? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, Arlene has warned me not to give long answers. It's hard to give a short answer to a question about China, but I'll do my best. I think the first thing is that, you know, in my time, as you recall, as premier, I went to China a number of times because I thought it was really important that we engage as a province, that we understand that this was going to be an important relationship for us and for Canadians for a long time to come, economically and every other way. The China that we see now is different. I mean, it's not like it's suddenly transformed to something else. First of all, since that time, it's become a huge economic power. It's the largest creditor in the world. It has loaned a lot of money to a lot of different countries all around the world, and with COVID and the impact of that, they're now at the center of this economic crunch that we're facing.
And just to interject briefly, that's an important point, because you can't just wish away China the way you can Venezuela if you wanted to, or China, or Cuba, or Iran.
Or even Russia. I mean, when we're dealing with people talk about a Cold War, this is different than was the situation before with Russia. Russia was a strange combination of a crumbling economic power with a very, very aggressive, political stance and a hammerlock on their own public and on the public of Eastern Europe in terms of their military power. They were fundamentally a military competitor, partly an aid competitor in some parts of the world, but it's very, very different. This is a different phenomenon. And so both on COVID and the economic output of that and climate change, China needs to engage with us. We need to engage with China on those kinds of issues. But we've also seen an increased authoritarianism. We've seen President Xi exercising a great deal of personal control. Everybody has to read his book. As you know, Martin, nobody reads my books, so it's just the way it is.
That's not true, because I actually have.
You can write them, but you don't necessarily read them. But there is an authoritarianism there that I think is dangerous, and it has, because it has implications for Taiwan, it has implications for Hong Kong, it has implications, as you said, for the Uyghurs, and it has terrible implications for the two Michaels and others who were affected by this positioning that they take. And
so
I think
if we can't ignore them, what do we do, and what do you do diplomatically?
Well, diplomacy works in different ways. My job at the UN is often to do things in public. It's often to do things in private. And I don't always talk about the things that I do, in conversation or the various meetings that you have with people that are off the record. And you're just trying to share information. And that's an important part of diplomacy. It's also a reality that the UN is a public place. So when I called out China on their treatment of the two Michaels, and we've done the same thing on the Uyghurs, and we're not alone. Many other countries joined us. We had nearly 40 countries signing a letter indicating our views about the Uyghurs, which is quite remarkable considering where we started when we began to really talk about there's some things we have to say publicly. China has never been reluctant to respond publicly, and that's fine. I mean, that I think is part of the dialogue, but I think it's important for our own publics and for the public generally to know is we have a very strong view about the taking of two Canadians on trumped up charges as a response to what we did, and I arguably can say had to do in response to an extradition request from the United States. And I think it's been very, very difficult. It's been very hard on the people in question, very hard. And it's been very hard on their families. But all you can say is you hope that at some point we'll find a way to resolve it. But I don't think anybody should be surprised by the fact that sometimes you express your views publicly because it needs to be said. And sometimes you express your views privately because you may get more results that way at a particular moment. I don't think it's a secret, I can say it, I talk to the Chinese ambassador. We're not uncivil to each other when we meet, but they also need to know how we feel, and they have no hesitation in expressing how they feel. That's actually a shift in Chinese diplomacy. They're much more, as you call it, wolf warrior, but I mean, in meetings and in conversation, they're much clearer about their views and why you're wrong and they're right. And that's part of what diplomacy is about.
Just briefly, digression, how has diplomacy changed in the pandemic? In the old days, you would have bumped into them in the hallway or in a lobby room or contrived to have an encounter, planted yourself in front of them, accosted them. now you got to do it by Zoom or by phone. How are you able to interact with them?
It's difficult. I mean, New York is a very different place. Ironically, I never lived in, I mean, I came to New York a number of times, but I never lived here before. And of course, when I was offered the chance to come, would you like to go to New York to represent Canada at the United Nations? I said, wow, are you kidding? Of course. But when we get here, you know, it's quiet, it's locked down, and I do this technology a lot. And yeah, it does. I think one of the things that what, if you like, COVID diplomacy is a lot more kind of speechifying. You're kind of, you know, making your point, then you shut up and listen, and you make another point. Yeah. You don't have the body language, you don't have the personal connection. You don't really make eye contact as directly as you would. So there's a lot of minuses. The plus of it is, for example, I chair something called the Peace Building Commission, which we do a lot of work looking at, you know, conflict situations. And there we're able to if we can get the technology to work properly, we can get people from civil society, we can get women, yeah, leaders of women's groups talking to us very directly. We can have a far more contact with people with us directly than we could have ever had if we had in-person meetings. And so it's, in some ways, we're going to keep on using some of this technology because it's so valuable, and it allows for, you know, talk about democracy, it allows for more participation and not just diplomats talking to each other, which is, I think, the criticism that one often hears about the UN.
So it opens doors at the same time as it restricts your margin of maneuver. Let's just circle back briefly to Xinjiang. When I was based in Hong Kong, I slipped into Urumqi and Kashgar, and it was very hard to watch the treatment and the restrictions that the Uyghurs faced. So you have asked for an investigation into this. The US, the incoming administration, has reiterated what the Trump administration said on its way out on its last day, that there was a genocide happening or patterns of genocide in Xinjiang. Who does what next on this one?
Well, I still think, I mean, if you look at, you mentioned the Rohingya, I mean, that was a situation that I was involved in. And one of the things that we were very fortunate to get was an excellent fact-finding mission appointed by the Human Rights Council that was headed up by the former Attorney General of Indonesia. And they did a first-rate job. They did an amazing job over, I guess it took them about a year and a half to complete their work. And they produced a body of information, but more importantly, they pointed the way to an evidence gathering process that really forced the rest of the world to say, you know what, this actually does, if it's proven to be the case, it does have the elements of a genocide. And when you look at the categories of information that we're getting about the Uyghur, it's very possible to say, well, we're going to reach the same conclusion. And what I say to people is, yes, that's certainly true. And that's why we shouldn't shy away from discussing it, the possibility or the elements of what it is that makes up a genocide. If you are, you know, preventing people from having children, if you're destroying a culture, you know, people sometimes think of genocide, that means you have to kill them all. And so unless you kill them all, it's not a genocide. And you say, no. I mean, in Rwanda, there were estimates of as, you know, many as several million. In the Holocaust, which we've just been commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day, 6 million. But in fact, it can be much less than that. It's not yeah, just about that. It's about the level and degree of repression that singles out a group and targets a group because it's a group, because it's the other. And I think if you look at the pattern in Xinjiang, in the far western province, and understand a bit of the history, this part of the world has always been betwixt and between China and all of the traditional territories to the west of China, and China said, no, that's ours, you know. So. But for long periods of time, historically, no, Xinjiang was part of other empires and self-governing in other ways. So the question really is, what is this repression, and how do we deal with it? The reality is, first of all, we have to be able to find out more about it. And the Chinese are even for you as a correspondent, you would have known very, very difficult to get there, very difficult to get the facts. But all the facts that we have and that we're getting point in a single direction. And I think that's where we've got to figure out what is the next stage of fact finding that actually gets us to go over this barrier from information, stories, newspaper reports, media reports, and evidence, something that could be actually used in an international court to say, no, this is what this is. But I think you're right. It's important that China feels this heat. They have to feel this heat.
But you're dealing with a superpower, which is different than dealing with Myanmar. And you're right, to get into China, to get into Xinjiang, I should say, I had to go in without a press visa, had to slip in. But also in Myanmar, Burma, I interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi, also without a press visa. I slipped in because she had just been released from house arrest. A person who was an icon for people, democracy activists around the world. And I want to ask you this as a practicing politician and now diplomat, and at that time a special envoy for their prime minister. There you were, face to face with Aung San Suu Kyi, and who was defending the military regime and was arguably an apologist for the regime. Now I know that she doesn't have the ability to control things, but what was that like for you as a kind of diplomat in training, as it were, as an envoy on a diplomatic mission, dealing with a politician who you had once admired, who was an honorary citizen of Canada and was now defending a potential genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar?
Well, I mean, again, it's a challenging story, but I mean, the fact is that she and I met a couple of times, and then the meetings that I had with her, and also that Mr. Trudeau had with her, it was clear that she was extremely defensive of whatever the government or people did, said we didn't know enough about the history, we didn't understand enough. And I said, well, when I met her, I said, okay, I'm going to learn, I'm going to read, I'm going to go visit people. I hope you won't prevent me from traveling. Initially, it was difficult for me. And then when I saw her the second time, I said, you're not letting me travel to learn what it is I need to know. And she said, fine, we'll arrange it. And I was able to travel. And the reality is that the crunch of the Rohingya problem is that they are a people who have not been allowed to have a place, who've not been recognized as citizens in Myanmar, and they're not even recognized as proper refugees in Bangladesh. They're people in transit, and it's a terrible thing to see people in a stateless position having nowhere they can say this is my home. So we have Rohingya who are still in Myanmar who have no status, and we have Rohingya who are in Bangladesh who have no real status either, except as guests of the government of Bangladesh. And it's a terrible, terrible situation. And
hence the title of your report.
I think she, I mean, Kofi Annan, I sound like a name dropper. When I met with Kofi Annan, was a great man. And I met with him in Geneva. And I said, what's your take on this? And he said, that everybody thought that she was a saint. And he looked at me and he said, Bob, none of us who've been in politics are saints, are we? I said, no, not really. And he said, and she's just a politician. And majority feeling in Myanmar is very hostile to the idea that the Rohingya are actually citizens of their country. And she was just she's riding that wave. She's riding that populist wave, even though in my view, it just ends in a dead end, because the fact is they've been there for generations. And as Canadians, we know that people shouldn't have to wait generations before they're allowed to become citizens.
Well, that's exactly right in terms of the statelessness. And I appreciate your confession, which we now have on tape, about politicians not being saints. But that's a really interesting observation, is that people saw her as a so-called non-politician. Of course, she's a politician. I don't think politicians are the saint, but they're not the devil either. And it's a question of what you do with that. Interesting thing, you talked about the UN using those investigative resources that the UN needs to bring to bear in Xinjiang. But your report also shed light on this. And when you talk about statelessness, the title of your report was interesting because it's "Tell Them We're Human." And that in a way encapsulates the problem. Let me just segue before I do to one last question before I turn it over to open the conversation to our listeners. And a reminder to people to start thinking up great questions. Some of you already have, but we'll turn to them in a minute or two. I just want to segue to Sri Lanka, another country that has been a prisoner of its own ethnic strife. And when you mention Canada's experience with multiculturalism, you and I have talked about Sri Lanka over the years. It's a country I covered for many years and visited many times. I know that on your last visit to Sri Lanka, you were not able to visit because you were deported. You were sent packing before you had unpacked your bags from the airport in Colombo on a plane back to London, as I recall. So Sri Lanka is, and there are a lot of refugees, there were a lot of refugees to Canada from Sri Lanka, a lot of Tamil Sri Lankans. So you also, people don't know this, in a previous life in between politics, were the founder of the Forum of Federations, I think it's called. And there was this idea to try to export not Canadian federalism, but maybe Indian, Australian, Canadian federalism to other countries that haven't figured out how to have large ethnic groups coexist and share power and share languages, which Sri Lanka tried to suppress years ago. So just tell us a little bit about how that, now that you're back in the business of diplomacy, how full-time, how do you meet your Sri Lankan counterparts, by the way? And when you see what's happening in Sri Lanka today, where there is a continued reluctance to bring people together, federalism, ethnic strife, how do you bring it all together?
Well, it's tough. I mean, yes, the prime minister, after I was defeated in '95, Mr. Chrétien called me, I guess, a few months later and said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm practicing law. And he said, yeah, but you got to do something more than that. And I said, well, what did you have in mind? He said, we've been having some conversations here about how do we create a broader international conversation on federalism. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I am a public lawyer by makeup, and he knew that. So I went up to see him and a few other people, Senator McEachern, a few others who'd gotten involved in this process. And at the end of the conversation, he said, we'd really like you to take this on. We want to start a forum. We want to, to figure out who else is interested. The Swiss became partners, and the Germans became partners, and the Australians. And we built it up. And by the way, the forum is still going. It's still yep. a very active NGO.
But why was it such a hard sell in Sri Lanka?
Well, no, they came to us. The Sri Lankans approached us. We were approached by Professor Peiris, who was a well-known constitutional lawyer in Sri Lanka, and said, we'd like to come and see you. And we said, fine. So we talked. They invited us to go. So I went with David Cameron at the end of the 90s. And we went at a time when the ceasefire between the Tamils and the Sinhalese government, the Sri Lankan government, had just started. There'd been a very violent set of conflicts, big planes being blown up at the airport, nobody in them, but a lot of really, really bad stuff was going down on all sides. And once the ceasefire was on, then the Norwegians said to us, would you like to help us on the governance issues? So we said yes, and David and I took a special interest in it, visited, I don't know, maybe 10 times, went to all of the conferences, all the meetings that they'd held, spent time in the jungle with the Tamil leadership yep. in their setup there in what's called the Vani. Right. Never met with Prabhakaran. He was a very elusive guy, didn't want to meet with well-meaning foreigners, but we did meet with most of the leadership, and of course we met with the government of Sri Lanka. Ultimately, I think it fell apart, and we warned them that it was falling apart, that it wasn't going in the right direction. The peace talks were not really engaging on the issues. We had a commitment from both of them at one important stage at a meeting in Oslo in the middle of winter, and both sides agreed that they would look at the federal option, which for both sides was a big deal. For the government of Sri Lanka, federalism was like the F word. No. And for the Tamils, the F word was not far off as well, because they saw the LTTE Tamils, who were really leading the discussion, saw federalism as a denial of their absolute right to an independent state. And they weren't interested in power sharing or any of the other elements of federalism. When I was thrown out was actually some years after that, about 3 years after that, after the slaughter on the beach where many tens of thousands of LTTE and their families were killed, and Prabhakaran was killed, and all the leadership that I had known was wiped out. And that was it. And I was an MP by that time. I went back to say, you know, can I come? The High Commissioner said, here's your visa. You can go and see for yourself. But when I got to the airport, they said, we think you're a terrorist. I said, well, you know, I don't really think so. He said, well, we will let you in if you agree that everything you've said or written about our country was wrong and that you were misled. And I said, you know, no. So they said, fine, go back on the next plane. So every diplomat that I meet from Sri Lanka, I just had a conversation with the new ambassador to the UN, who's a former attorney general of their country. And I said, are you sure you want to talk to me? I thought you guys thought I was a terrorist. And they're very embarrassed. Now they say, oh no, that was a terrible mistake. You know, that should never have happened. But there's still an issue now. I mean, although the military victory happened. There was the leadership of the LTT was wiped out. But the problem is that the dream of pluralism, the dream of legal recognition of a degree of autonomy for the North and parts of the East, the dream of full recognition of the language, full civil and other political rights. That dream is still there, and plus, I think that people are looking for an apology, because there's no question. I know people are looking for more than an apology, looking for truth and reconciliation, but they're looking for recognition that what happened was just plain wrong in terms of the level and degree of repression and suppression, and that the denial of their civil rights is still a problem. And so far, the government of Sri Lanka says nothing doing. We're not prepared to do that. We have our own processes that will follow. So yeah, do I discuss it with their representatives? Absolutely.
You're no longer persona non grata.
Not in a conversation, anyway.
It's interesting when the tension you describe, even with the F word, as you describe it in Sri Lanka and the LTTE at the time, that they wanted more than federalism. They wanted sovereignty, and you would have had some experience in that in your own constitutional wars, peaceful constitutional wars here at home, for which you have some battle scars. Let me segue to this. Is unsurprisingly, given the conversation and given the news today, there are a lot of questions about Ethiopia. And so let me lead off with a question from Johannes, which kind of summarizes some of the other questions that are very similar. Excellency, millions of people are trapped in a devastating war waged in Tigray simply for exercising their basic human rights. UN agencies on the ground are warning of looming starvation, but the Ethiopian government is blocking humanitarian aid. What is Canada's stand on this issue?
Well, our stand on this issue and on many other issues is that humanitarian access is a fundamental right, and denying humanitarian access is not acceptable. We have told that to the Ethiopian government. We have made it clear in every way that we possibly can, and we will continue to put as much pressure as we can on the Ethiopian government to allow for access by the Red Cross, by other agencies, and frankly, in a process that will look and investigate and say what exactly happened. The story from the Ethiopian government is, of course, different from the story from the perspective of your questioner, and I think it's important for us again to say, well, let's get at the facts. But as we're getting at the facts, this is not an academic or judicial exercise alone. It's one where we have to feed people. And we've made it very clear the World Food Program isn't getting in the extent to which it needs to. Starvation is not an acceptable tactic. And we know in most parts of the world, famine and starvation is actually a political event. Drought is what nature does. But for drought to turn into a famine is about politics. And that's where it becomes just unacceptable.
Another conflict question from Kiki Roach. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has said that Yemeni civilians are facing the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, with over 24 million people in need due to the war being waged on them by Saudi Arabia. What can you do to get the Canadian government to stop the sale and shipment of military equipment and arms to Saudi Arabia?
Well, let's be clear, we're not selling arms. We've never sold arms to Saudi Arabia. We don't sell arms to any of the parties to the conflict. And I've talked quite a lot with the UN Special Representative Martin Griffiths, who's a very, very bright, capable, seasoned negotiator who's been doing everything he can to get the parties to the table and to figure out a way to resolve the conflict and end the conflict. The decision by the government and by previous governments to sell vehicles to military vehicles to the Saudis that's a decision that's been made. It'll be up to the government to decide, what it does in that circumstance. But based on my conversations, I really believe that over the last several months, there's been a determination, I think, by many of the parties to the conflict that this can't go on. I think people are trying to figure out a way to get to a peaceful resolution. But I would never. Canada has never had a policy of selling arms to combatants in the middle of a conflict like this. That's not something we're doing here. It's not something we should do.
Okay, it really is a forgotten war. It's a country I visited in between civil wars, and it was already at the bottom in terms of literacy and poverty, and to have this conflict going on.
It's the site of what is what I mean. That is, if just for your listeners, the best website to go on in terms of understanding the nature of the humanitarian impact of conflict is the website of an organization called OCHA, which is it's the UN committee that coordinates all the humanitarian assistance around the world. And OCHA has the best handle, and the people there make it very clear that the Yemeni crisis is the worst in terms of its immediate potential to become a real hotspot of famine. South Sudan is another one. The Tigray-Ethiopian conflict, which is relatively recent in terms of its impact, but it's having a very severe instant humanitarian impact. These are the ones that are at the moment at the top of the list. But tragically, in part because of COVID and the economic impact of COVID, there are, unfortunately, a great many others.
Yeah, really, and as you suggest, no shortage of civil wars in that region, and South Sudan, a country I've been to as well, where it is just heartbreaking to see sovereignty achieved and civil war break out anew. I'm going to make a bit of a stretch here. We're talking about Yemen, and there's a lot of allegations of Iranian involvement. I'm going to segue to Iran just briefly before we go back to other questions, and ask if you, again, give us a bit of your statecraft and stagecraft in terms of, do you interact with your Iranian counterparts at the UN? Because under the Harper government, we cut off diplomatic relations, essentially suspended them, closed our embassy, but also essentially tried to ostracize the regime. And then a horrific shooting of an airliner that involved about over 80, I believe, as I recall, Iranian Canadians and residents of Canada. And we were without an embassy, and we have a government in Iran that has not really accepted full responsibility and redress for this. People may remember that you did a preliminary inquiry of sorts into the Air India disaster to set the stage for that. And so here we are, once again, a downing of Canadian planes. Do you have any anything to tell us about the Iranian government and its handling and mishandling of this disaster?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would suggest everyone read Ralph Goodale's report. It's a very good report, and he did a very good study of what happened, and I think he's raised a number of really critical questions about what should happen next. Where you were starting with your question was what about what's the difference between talking and not talking? I have to say I am not somebody who believes that it's a great idea to stop talking or to stop engaging with people with whom you have real disagreements. I think that's, I mean, diplomacy is we're not, when you have diplomatic recognition of a government, or you send an ambassador, or you have relations of one kind and another, you're not saying we love these guys, we approve them. We don't just send our diplomats to the places where they know they're going to be welcome and it's going to be great and it's going to be terrific. And I think this policy of pulling people out is frankly counterproductive. I actually, as an opposition foreign affairs critic, when John Baird, phoned me and he said, we have lots of information and that we want to protect our citizens there. We think there could be bombing there shortly when we're getting them all out. I said, John, I think you're making a mistake. I happen to know the guy who was looking forward to going to Iran on behalf of Canada. I said, you don't pull your people out of spots because they're difficult. That's what they expect to be doing. And I don't believe that there's a risk to life and limb there at the moment. And
well, not to name drop, but I've also said exactly the same thing to John Baird when I accosted him once in Ottawa, and of course he said what he would say. I've also spent time in Iran with our former ambassador Michel de Salaberry. So if you're on record as supporting, why don't we reopen the embassy in Tehran now? It's been a few years.
Well, I mean, I think I would also say that one of the things about being at the UN is you do meet diplomats from other countries, and you do regularly relate and connect with them on a number of different issues. One of the difficult parts of our relationship here is, of course, we have a particular set of issues around the plight of the Canadians and how their situation has not been adequately recognized and has not been adequately dealt with at all. And that's something which we have to deal with on an ongoing basis. The other reality is that the decision that will be made to recognize one government or not recognize, but to have a diplomats in place is as they say, it's beyond my pay grade. But everybody knows my view, and the government has to make its decisions accordingly. But I do think that as Canadians, because it's after all public opinion that helps to create the drive as to why governments do what they do. I really think it's important that, and Shimon Peres used to say this, and he was absolutely right. You talk to your enemies. You don't always talk to your friends. Your friends, you know what they think. The people you have to talk to are the people that you're fighting with or you have a real disagreement with. And I think it might have been, I still think that it's something that governments will think about and deal with. But I do believe that as a general principle, it's important to separate out the mechanics of why you have diplomatic relations for consular reasons. We have lots of Canadian citizens living in Iran, lots of families with connections to Canada living in Iran. It's not, we sure do. And this notion somehow that if we pull out, it'll be the end of the regime. They'll collapse the next week. Is really? Well, I don't think so. And that's not.
We've had this empirical experiment, and it hasn't happened in all these years. But I want to make a plug. I want to make a plug about, because everything you said about diplomacy, I think we can apply to democracy as well. That you do have to engage with your enemies, and there is a fashion now to shout down. I don't want to sound like an old fogey, but there is a fashion to now to shout down or demonize your enemies. And sometimes you have to, if you have a true Trump demon, to put it, if I can put it that way, in the White House, an insurrectionist. But at other times, you surely have to engage. That is the essence of democracy, just as it is diplomacy. So let me turn to a question from David. Folks, by the way, give us your full name if you want us to give you a shout out. And David asks, equitable distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine is a major global challenge. Do you think Canada has a responsibility to help ensure that low-income countries have access to the vaccine and about the same timeline that it is distributed here in Canada and other wealthy countries? If so, what are the best ways for Canada to help the world achieve this goal, and what steps are we taking or should we take to get there?
I'm delighted to get the question, because it's something I really believe in very strongly, and I've spent a lot of time in New York working on this, and I've also spent a lot of time in Ottawa, or in conversations with Ottawa about what more we can do. I am a big believer that COVID is a global pandemic, and it requires a global response, and that a lot of the world's responses have so far been pretty much based on, well, what are the needs of the local, what's the needs of our people? What are we doing for us? And to be honest, as I sit in front of my television in New York, or as I was over Christmas time in Toronto, the news is all about us. The news is about, what about us? What about me? And the news isn't, well, what are we doing for? So yesterday, for example, how many people know that Karina Gould, the Minister of Health of Ethiopia, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Indonesia are the three co-chairs of the committee of this facility that's been created by the world called COVAX, C-O-V-A-X. Mm-hmm. And they were able to announce that we're going to be distributing vaccines in February. We hope to have as many as 2 billion doses distributed by the end of 2021. So, and Canada's put in, well, a lot of money for us, put in a lot of money for COVAX, and now the Americans are finally coming back into it. And I hope that this is one of the things where I think a Biden administration can help to change the international conversation. But the questioner, David, what you were asking is, do I believe that everybody should have as equal as possible access to the vaccine? Absolutely, I do. I think there are two ways that we've been doing it. One is to say we're going to continue to fund COVAX, and we will be doing more to fund COVAX. And COVAX is an independent organization that has signed its own contracts with Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, whoever else is available. And I also believe that if we find it a situation that we now have a surplus because of the fact that we've got so many contracts out, which is, I think, been wise on the part of the government to do that, to ensure that Canadians can't do it. But one of the realities, and speaking as a former politician, if a government stood up and said, you know what, we think it's more important to do other countries first. We're going to ask Canadians to hold back, and then we're going to take care of others first. I mean, that wouldn't work. It would politically be like, so you've got to say, we're going to do both. We're going to take care of our own. We're going to make sure we've got enough for everybody. And we are going to be part of a much, much bigger global campaign than we've imagined so far. Because even the number of 2 billion, when you consider the world's 2 billion doses is 1 billion people, world's population is 7, 8 billion people. Now, a lot of those people are covered by their own governments. The Indians and the Chinese are doing their own thing, although they're far from having vaccinated everybody. But we need to understand that the health security, the vaccine, the economic and social, the financial consequences of COVID are a big deal, and they are global. They're not national. And if we only have a national response, it's not good enough. There has to be a powerful global response.
Thank you for helping to connect the dots there, because I think, we've heard that Canada has been a major funder of the COVAX initiative. That tends to get drowned out by the big news that Canada has secured a supply that is many times over our population, and people are kind of poking fun at us for that, at the same time as people are hammering us for our government federally for not getting more of it here faster. But you're quite right that as a politician turned diplomat, the idea that a politician who has to get elected would say to voters, hey, we're gonna share this vaccine first, that may be and is a commendable impulse, or not share it first, but share at the same time. But that is just not realistic in political terms. And I think you've expressed the need for us to do a few things at the same time.
Well, I think we have to do it at the same time. And I think the best way to do it quite honestly, I think the Prime Minister has done it. I mean, he said, we're not hoarding anything. When we have a surplus or when we know what the supply situation is, how to do it, we know it, we're going to share whatever we have with COVAX or with however the government decides ultimately to do it. And he said, we're going to fund COVAX. We're going to be one of the early funders in a big, big way to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're going to continue, and Canada's led with Jamaica at the UN, this financing for development project and advocacy, where we're working with the developing countries and we're working with the wealthier countries to create the kinds of changes in the rules of the IMF, what the World Bank is doing, how do we get countries back on their feet? And, oh, by the way, how do we build back in a way that is going to be more sustainable? Because there might be some who think this is some kind of a plot to talk about climate change. You can't not talk about climate change. Right. It's a real thing. And we've got to work. We've got to do all these things together.
Folks, we're slowly coming to towards our 5 o'clock close, but I think we're going to try to go into overtime for a few minutes. So if you have some more questions, send them in. I'm going to go here to Tom, who just asks, is it important for Canada to pursue, is it really that important for Canada to be pursuing all this time a spot on the UN Security Council, or can we just let it go once and for all?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's 2 seats available to Canada every 2 years. Right. And there's a long lineup and this comes from the regional grouping that's called Western Europe and Other Governments, or everything here has an acronym in the UN, a million alphabet soup. So
but let me stop you there. But before you go into that rabbit hole of because I'm familiar with that rabbit hole. But the question in Tom's defense is it important to us? I mean, we know how hard it is, and we know that we are losing out. We're not part of the Western European group and quid pro quos. But why is it really worth the effort and bending ourselves out of shape to do it?
I don't think we're bending. I would never advocate bending yourself out of shape to do it. I think the fact is that we're always going to be off the Security Council way, 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 way more than we're going to be on it. You don't have to be on the Security Council to matter at the UN. We're a major funder of the United Nations. We're in the top 10 donor group. I was just at a meeting of the General Assembly this morning where the Secretary General gave his report. He went out of his way to praise Canada's work on financing for development, Canada's work as chairing the Peace Building Commission and being an important leader in the United Nations. So the short answer is, it's not about the Security Council. It's about, are you playing a leadership role in everything that you're doing? Is it good from time to time to be on the Security Council? Yeah, I think it probably is. But it's not easy to get on. And I certainly don't think we should twist ourselves out of shape in any way, shape, or form. And I have to say that since coming here, I don't think anybody has spent any time telling me, not it's a terrible indication, it's a reflection of your weakness, and no, none of that. We're players in the UN. We're significant players because we pay up, we pay on time, and because we have ideas and we have energy and we have focus, and all those things make a difference.
Let me ask you one other quick UN question from Taufik. Interesting story here. My grandfather was acquainted with Sir Zafrullah Khan, who was president of the UN General Assembly. And today's people seem to think that the UN has become like the League of Nations. So how can the UN change that perception? How has the power of diplomacy in the UN deteriorated due to the fact of the various never-ending conflicts that we've seen in the world today and that we've talked about today?
I think the most important, I think, well, first of all, I mean, I'm dating myself, but I also knew Sir Zafrullah Khan. Zaf Khan was a great man and a great character judge on the International Court and a very, very distinguished jurist. He was a guest at the U of T when I was a student in the 60s, so I met him then. But no, the key to the UN's relevance is and why it's different from the League, and I've thought a lot about this, is that it's not just a political organization. Actually, most of what the UN does is on development, on the economy, on getting food to people, on making a difference in people's lives. And Canadians don't see any of that side of it because we don't have the UN coming here and saying, this is what you should be doing in education, and this is. I mean, they come here and tell us these things, but it doesn't have the same impact. But in large parts of the world, the UN is a vital deliverer of services and plays an enormous role in the life of people. And I think that's really what makes people keep coming back and saying, can't we do better? Where the UN has challenges is because of the arguments between its members. And it's important to remember, and this is not original to me, is that blaming the UN for this conflict or that conflict is a lot like blaming the Air Canada Centre for how well the Leafs are doing. I mean, it's not actually connected. The UN is a structure where it's actually a service agent, an effective government. It's doing a good job. I think most people recognize it's actually doing an extraordinary job in much of what we don't see. It's the part of the iceberg that doesn't get enough attention.
Well, I think that's if I may, that's a pretty good description of perception and reality. Not that the UN is perfect, but the perception, I think, is way out of whack with some of that reality, which I've seen. You didn't mention the World Food Program, which is a lifeline in Ethiopia or in Sudan and other countries as well.
Just won the Nobel Prize.
So here's a question from Glenn Pettifer. Thank you so much for your presence today. If I may, I'd like to shift our gaze homeward. As you speak, it's apparent to me that some of the language you use in describing the trials of marginalized and persecuted people abroad also describes the relationship between Canada's Indigenous people and the government of Canada. Can you comment on some of those similarities? And as Canada's ambassador to the UN, how do you respond when you're asked about this relationship? Good question, because you have spent a lot of time, not everyone knows this, on Indigenous affairs as an advisor and an advocate. I think I once flew with you to Northern Ontario on a chartered DC-3 to do a bunch of whistle-stop tours and so on. So how do you make that connection about Canada's own situation when speaking about the world situation?
We're part of the world. I mean, think of the world, think of us as being part of world history, world geography. We were part of an empire. We were peopled by settlers who came from other countries several hundred years ago, and now people have come here from all over the world. The original people of Canada, original people who lived on this land, and who we now talk about in terms of the opening of conferences and so on, have been marginalized, just as they have been marginalized in Australia, just as they've been marginalized in the United States, just as they've been marginalized in many parts of the Americas. So I talk about it a lot. Canada is actually member of groups of nations that get together and talk about indigeneity and the nature of the conflict. We have very strong relationships with countries like Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia and others who are very active in dealing with Indigenous rights. We have a resolution that's worked on every year. We have the universal, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canadian Indigenous people had a lot to do with building it. The question of Indigenous rights is now a global question. It's no longer a national question for us or for any other country. And in our case, the challenge is that the Indigenous people are a minority in terms of numbers, and so the marginalization is something, and the discrimination, the repression, is something that's been allowed to happen without enough of a political response. I can remember an Indigenous leader saying to me, he said, well, how come nobody's watching, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And in South Africa, everybody was watching it. And I said, well, the difference is the numbers. The only difference between Canada and South Africa is the numbers, is the fact that 90% of Canadians don't consider themselves to be Indigenous, and in South Africa, it's the other way around. So these are things that we discuss. I can only tell you, and they're unavoidable now. The gaze of the world is on us, and don't think that This is a source of reality for us in world context that we can't pretend isn't true anymore, even if we wanted to. And luckily, I'm proud to represent a government that doesn't want to hide it. The first speech that Prime Minister Trudeau gave to the United Nations as Prime Minister was about our Indigenous situation. It concentrated on it, and the reason he did was because he wanted to make it clear, we're not preaching from on high to you about human rights. We know we have our own road to walk, and we're still walking it.
It wouldn't be possible to talk about the whole world without touching on the Middle East and the state of play there. I spent 4 years there for the Star, and there is no shortage of armchair experts on the Middle East that are often second-guessing coverage for a journalist, and I'm sure for you as a diplomat. But a serious question here from, I don't think there's a name attached to this, but with the issue of peace absent from the current Israeli election campaign, they're not talking about the peace process much, and with the normalization accords with Morocco and of course the other countries in the Gulf, effectively trying to set aside the Palestinian issue, what role can Canada play to bring Israel and Palestine back to the negotiating table in a context where it seems that momentum for the two-state solution has run out? What can we do?
Well, it's a good question. And first of all, the Palestinian issue cannot be set aside for the simple reason that Palestinians are there. and their position, you'll have to forgive the
New York.
It's New York. It's still New York. There's a theory in Israel amongst many Israelis that we can manage this. We can manage this problem. And we're not going to find the solution. We're not going to be able to resolve it. We'll just manage it. The problem with that is that, and I think we're seeing this, is that there's contradictions in the management, because the rights of Palestinians and the rights of Israelis are not the same. And Martin's talking a lot about democracy, and the central contradiction is the same contradiction as we see in many other countries, is that you can't have a group of people who don't have a country because they're not able to participate here, they can't participate there, and so we have to deal with that contradiction, and that contradiction can't be avoided and has to be faced up to. I think I think that one of the things that has happened is, we're all a product of our experience. In my experience in the Constitution, if somebody said to me, would you like to go back and negotiate the Canadian Constitution again? I'd say, no, I don't want to do that. I've done that twice, actually 3 times. And I really don't want to do that. I really don't want to do that again. Not because it's not interesting, but because it's just, you can't go back. And I think the same thing is true for, the Oslo agreements and the other attempts, the other things that got so far. And I think one of the reasons that nobody wants to say, yes, we're going to go back to the table, is because they're just afraid of another failure, and they don't want to fail again. That doesn't mean people are not talking. People are talking. Even when they say they're not talking, they're talking. Are they talking about big enough solutions? Not yet. Is it more possible that they can? I think so. And I think part of what's happened is things change. People say, oh, they're stuck. The sides are the same. This side, this position. There's too many moving parts now. Yeah. 4 years ago, we wouldn't be having the same conversation about all the other things that have been done. But one of the arguments that I don't agree with is to say, well, all these agreements have been signed with all the other countries, or many other countries in the Arab world. This means the issues are being resolved. And I say they're very positive, and important steps are being taken. And this non-recognition of Israel is finally coming to an end. This notion that, we don't recognize, we don't want Israel to be there. We deny Israel's existence. That's starting to come to an end, except for some terrible examples on that side. But it doesn't mean that that doesn't lead to the logical conclusion that we've resolved this crisis, because we haven't. Because as long as the Israel-Palestine issues are not on a step to resolution, then we still have work to do. And we do. Canada does that. We do that, but mainly right now we're doing it quietly. And one of the reasons we're doing it quietly is because this is something that only benefits from people actually engaging quietly and figuring out how do we do this. And that's the way I think it should be for the moment, as long as we're clear. And that's why Canada's vote the last two years has been very clear. We support a Palestinian right to self-determination. We support that. And we support Israel's right to exist in security with secure borders. We support those positions. We support a real two-state solution, but it has to be real.
And you took a little bit of heat for that. And I think we're able to articulate that we had to keep our eye on the ball and understand the two-state solution and not get distracted too much by rhetoric. Let me throw in two more quick questions if I can. Helen Lucas asks you, Ambassador Ray, is there anything you can do along with your colleagues at the UN about the rise of fascism and authoritarianism worldwide?
I think the main thing we can do is call it for what it is. I've given a lot of speeches and talks at the UN about authoritarian populism. I think we all understand its threat to us. We don't live in, this notion that we live in a post-truth era. No, we don't. We live in an era when there are people who'd like to pretend that there's no such thing as facts and no such thing as the truth. But that's where fascism starts. If you go back to Mussolini and Hitler, they specialized in denying the existence of facts and changing things and saying, well, it's just all relative and there we go. And their use of propaganda, their use of demonization, these are all things that we can trace to the fascist handbook. And we should call it out. And I think more and more people are calling it out. I think that's a good thing. And we shouldn't be afraid to do that.
Quick question, quick answer if I can. Recently, no name attached to this, but on everyone's minds, recently China has taken a firmer stance on Taiwan's independence, stating that seeking this independence would lead to war. Do you anticipate conflict? And if so, what would be Canada's stance? Now, let me just add editorially, people have been predicting conflict over the Taiwan Straits for decades, and it hasn't happened, but circumstances have changed. But give us your thoughts about imminent conflict. But also, I forgot to ask you, so I want to circle back to what you may be doing, and certainly what Canada is doing in trying to forge alliances with other like-minded countries so that we're not just sticking our neck out as China pursues a divide and conquer strategy, whether with Taiwan or Hong Kong or Canada or Australia, but trying to act in a cohesive way.
I think that will be an important part of what we do globally and at the UN and Geneva and elsewhere. We've been doing it here. We've been talking to a number of countries and ambassadors. We're doing it in capitals about some of the common things we need to do. We need to be aware of. We need to be working together, sharing information. It's not a kind of it's not a gang up or anything. It's just a way of saying, this is happening and we need to be aware of it. And certainly that's a very important part of what we're doing. On Taiwan, I mean, I visited Taiwan a number of times. In fact, I paid an official visit there as premier, which caused a huge ruckus with the Chinese at the time. And I frankly just ignored it. Taiwan is a real place. And it's not a figment of anybody's imagination. It's not an artificial creation by Chiang Kai-shek. There are millions and millions of real people. They've created a real economy and they've created a democracy. Chiang Kai-shek was not a natural democrat, as it were, but when he died and things moved on, there was just a greater demand for more democracy. It's a very vibrant, democratic place, and I think that if China were to go too far in its responses, I do think it would be the source of a major conflict with the United States and with a number of the rest of us who would not let that go quietly. You can't let that number of people just be obliterated in the name of one kind of nationalism or another.
The stakes are very high.
They are very high. And that's one of the reasons why I don't believe that a simple kind of military move is the one that's the most likely to happen. I think it's going to get much more complicated than that in terms of economies and various other ways in which people compete. But we support a one China policy. We support that China is the government of China. And that was the basis upon which we exchanged our diplomatic recognition in 1970 when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada. And he did the right thing.
A creative political and diplomatic solution to a complex problem.
Yeah,
we are almost out of time for questions. There is one more question that I want to put to you from somebody, and it merges with one of my own. It's from Jen Sanford. The question is, what advice do you have for mid-career professionals who want to engage in helping address the world's biggest challenges and greatest opportunities, but don't know where to start? Before you answer, I want to blend that in with my own closing question, which is that every time I talk to students here at Ryerson or at the Monk Center where you taught, inevitably somebody asks about a career in politics, in public service, the two are related, or in the foreign service. And you have done all three. So before we close and thank you, any closing thoughts you have for students, professors, and mid-career professionals about how to do good work?
Well, I think the first thing is there's lots of ways to do it. And the second thing I would say is based on my rather crooked, I don't mean crooked in the sense of dishonest, but crooked zigzag career. Just keep going. I mean, just keep on going. Just explore the opportunities that are there. There's routes to follow. There's NGO, the NGO world, which we really haven't talked about, is a huge world. The NGO world at the UN is a huge world. There are many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people who are working in organizations that are non-governmental of one kind and another, who are always looking for good people, for not only paid people, but for volunteers, for various people who want to work in them in a variety of ways. And that's a hugely productive way to think about pursuing a life and an interest. I think the main thing about it is, can you choose between public service and politics and foreign service? I mean, my view is you can actually do all three. You can actually, what I've done is not that extraordinary. It's not like nobody's ever done this before. You just keep going and don't pay a lot of attention to the criticism any more than you have to, and just keep doing what you're trying to do and always try to make a contribution. And I think if you do that, then it's very worthwhile. I must say I have no regrets about the life that I've been living, and I don't think it's I don't think it's over. I'm just going to keep on going until it's not. But I mean, I just think as long as you've got your wits about you, it's just terrific.
As a political journalist, one of the things I admire in politicians is the willingness to take a punch and to pick themselves up off the mat. I apologize for the boxing analogy. I'm not actually a boxing fan, but a lot of politicians are actually former boxers, and it is a skill set to be able to pick yourself up off the mat again. Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you for sharing some of your war stories, your political stories, your diplomatic stories, and for taking us through a bit of a political journey. We appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your time while you are very busy saving the world. Thank you also to everyone in our audience who listened in and who asked questions. Before you go, I just want to quickly tip you off to our next Ryerson Democracy Forum. It's coming up next week. The title is Workers' Rights and Governments of the Right, Can We Talk? And my guest will be Labour Minister Monty McNaughton, Canadian Labour Congress President Hassan Youssef, and Ryerson's visiting practitioner, Peggy Nash. You can check it out online and RSVP to get the Zoom link, just like you did today. I think it'll be a really interesting example of democracy and dialogue in action, if not always diplomacy. And finally, a special thanks to the Faculty of Arts here for hosting today's event, the Dean, Dr. Pam Sugerman, and the Head of Strategic Planning and Operations, Melissa Wong. Stay safe. See you next Tuesday for our event on workers' rights. And thanks again to the Ambassador. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it very much. Good to be with you, Martin. Take care.
Thank you, Bob. Stay safe.